Hello, and welcome to my gallery talk, in which we will explore two very different pieces, separated by medium, origin, time period, and subject. The first piece will show an example of a major icon, while the second will show an example of minor icons. The first piece we will analyze today is a painting from the early 18th century in Tibet. Tibetan Buddhism has its own unique set of beliefs, practices, and characteristics, formed by a combination of Mahayana, Tantric, and shamanistic influences, and mixed with Bon, an ancient Tibetan religion that predates Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism is often compared with Vajrayana Buddhism, and the two are taught as a part of Tibetan Buddhism. These influences have resulted in a special form of Buddhism that features many rituals and spiritual practices, such as mantras, meditation, yogic techniques, prostration, and repetitive prayers and ceremonies. Buddhism came to Tibet at the end of the 8th century with Indian Buddhist masters who traveled to Tibet with translations of Buddhist texts. Like King Ashoka of India and Shotoku of Japan, Buddhism flourished under a specific political figure, King Trisong Detsen, who invited the Indian Buddhists to come to his court and oversee the construction of Buddhist monasteries. Buddhism became extremely popular in Tibet, and Tibetan Buddhism is now famous around the world for its unique art, rituals, and figures such as the Dalai Lama. Before the Chinese occupation of Tibet, 1 in 6 Tibetan men were Buddhist monks, demonstrating how powerful Buddhism was in Tibet. The painting, entitled Yamantaka, Destroyer of the God of Death, shows a scene in which Yamantaka, a form of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, defeats Yama, the God of Death. Yamantaka is the large blue figure in the center of the painting, and Yama is the man beneath his feet, sprawled on the ground. Around the center action are many smaller figures riding buffaloes, such as these. These are also Yama destroyers. At the top of the painting are 2 lamas with pink halos to distinguish their sanctity, and they have attending lesser lamas surrounding them as well. Yamantaka's iconography includes his blue skin, his skull crown, his eerie belt of severed heads, and the buffaloes present throughout the painting. By defeating Yama, the god of death, Yamantaka symbolically ends the symbol of rebirth known as samsara, meaning that enlightenment, or nirvana, has been achieved. This piece is actually a very good example of Tibetan Buddhist art for several reasons. The first being the actual style of the piece, which is incredibly colorful, busy, patterned, and bold. Tibetan Buddhist art has always stood out for these reasons, as strong visuals and symbolism are common. The dimensions of this piece are 72 by 46 inches, so it's actually quite large, making it extremely eye-catching and intimidating when seen in person. The centrality of Yamantaka and his lore is also necessary to understanding this piece. In Tibetan Buddhism, local gods and spirits often make their way into mythology and are an important part of the religion. Bodhisattvas combine with these figures to become new deities. It is not unusual for these deities to have multiple forms, one benevolent and one vengeful. Yamantaka is an example of one of these, being the violent and aggressive form of Bodhisattva Manjushri. Manjushri is the most important bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism and is connected with the lotus because of the blossoming of the wisdom he imparts upon followers. The iconography of the lotus is present in this painting as it lays beneath Yamantaka and Yama. One of the prominent aspects of Tibetan Buddhism is the special interest in the role of death to the practice, as well as the relationship between life and death. Death is required to move on to the next reincarnation, which makes it sacred, but it must be vanquished to reach nirvana. Yamantaka's bold stance, fearsome appearance, and his crown of skulls and his elaborate jewels show his value as the conqueror of death and the importance of death in the religion. The lamas in the top corners, identified by the Met as Panchen and Atisha Lama, are also important to understanding Tibetan Buddhism. The lamas have crowns and halos to demonstrate their importance, and they are placed at the top of the frame to show the lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. One of the unique features of Tibetan Buddhism is the intense hierarchy, at the top of which are the most sacred leaders and teachers, the lamas. The second piece we will look at is a much more muted classic example of Buddhist art. It is a small silver cup stand, just 6 1/8 inches in diameter, from Yuan Dynasty China, 14th century, adorned with the 8 Buddhist treasures. The visual simplicity of the piece, in addition to its common household purpose, suit the minor status of the icons in comparison with the painting of Yamantaka. The Yuan dynasty is also known as the Mongol dynasty, as Mongol conquerors ruled China during this time. This in turn had an effect upon the art of the time period. In retaliation against their conquerors, native Chinese began to seek out art forms that celebrated their own traditions. One way in which this manifested was in simplification. Another way was in the use of traditional materials such as silver, lacquer, and ceramics. This piece excellently demonstrates the simplification, and it is done in traditional Chinese silver. During the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols funded a renewal of Buddhist art forms to enforce their rule upon the Chinese against the Chinese art revival movement. Oddly enough, this piece seems to represent both sides of the artistic feud, being both a Buddhist piece and in the traditional Chinese style. Its role as a cup stand, a commonplace household item, demonstrates that Buddhism was probably extremely widespread and accepted across China during this time. This piece was probably owned by an aristocratic family as it is cast in solid silver and would have been quite expensive. The 8 Buddhist treasures in order from the top treasure clockwise are a victory banner, a conch shell, an endless knot, a wheel, elephant tusks, a treasure vase, a pair of fish, and lotus flowers. One unusual characteristic of this piece is the inclusion of the elephant tusks, as they are usually replaced with a parasol. The treasures are referred to as the Ashtamangala and are especially sacred objects that frequent Buddhist art. The victory banner has roots in ancient Indian military practices. It represents the Buddha's victory over the Maras, pride, desire, unsettling emotions, and the fear of death. The conch represents the call to complete one's dharma, as it can be used as a horn. The endless knot symbolizes the interconnectedness of religion and everyday life, as well as the completeness of wisdom that one can attain from Buddhism. The wheel is one of the oldest and most famous symbols in Buddhism, representing the teachings of Gautama Buddha. This wheel has 6 points, but a typical Buddhist wheel would have 8, in alignment with the Eightfold Path. The elephant tusks, replacing the traditional parasol treasure, are a symbol of power, royalty, and the Gautama Buddha. In one Jataka, Gautama Buddha lives as a white elephant, so the presence of the pair of tusks is in reference to this. The treasure vase represents good health, longevity, and a prosperous life. The vase is said to be bottomless, just like the teachings of Buddhism. The pair of fish symbolize the auspiciousness of all forms of life on earth. As the fish swim through water, so do all of earth's living things through samsara. Lastly, the lotus represents purity, which is necessary in the body, mind, and spirit in order to achieve religious understanding. Together, these pieces represent 2 extremely different forms of Buddhist art and practice. One a bold painting paying homage to a major Buddhist icon, another a simple household item embellished with minor icons. However, both pieces draw deeply from the religious thought and bring understanding to the time periods and contexts in which they were created. Thank you for listening.